know, these are exceptional times in agriculture, so our timing couldn't be much better. We want to start out this morning with a lot of different things, but first off, we have a very important speaker who has a plane to catch, and we want to make sure he has time to make his opening comments. I don't think our next speaker is really any stranger to many of you. Senator Moran has been crisscrossing the great state of Kansas over the last week, and he's a tireless person in terms of his outreach and trying to make sure that he is on top of all the most pressing issues for his constituents. During a time, you know, when it's kind of easy to criticize a lot of our lawmakers, Senator Moran really stands out as an exception. He's a true friend of agriculture, and he serves on several important committees, including a Senate Appropriations Committee, its Ag Subcommittee, and Commerce and Veterans Affairs. So without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Senator Jerry Moran.
Sarah, thank you. Sarah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being here in Kansas City and providing your expertise and knowledge to the Kansas City Agribusiness Council and its members. I learned something from you. Sarah gave a few remarks earlier this morning to bring us up to the latest news. What I learned from Sarah this morning is the Chiefs lost. I had no idea until you said it, and I'm saddened by that. We were at the Royals game yesterday. This visit to Kansas City this morning gave us a chance to see the Royals, and they lost 7-1. So it wasn't a great weekend for Kansas City and its professional sports. And Bob Peterson, thank you for the invitation to join you, and thank you for your leadership here in the Kansas City Business Council. And to Dr. Featherstone, thank you for your hosting in Kansas State University's College of Agriculture's engagement. I like this event, and I wasn't here last year because it was oddly done because of COVID. I was here 2 years ago, and this event, I think, is hugely important as those of us who recognize the importance of agriculture to Kansas, to Missouri, to our country. It allows us to highlight for a broader community here in Kansas City, the urban area of my state, how important agriculture is. And even if you aren't a farmer or a rancher, what happens in agriculture has a significant impact upon the future of communities across our state and across Missouri as well. So thank you for the leadership that you provide, the attention that you bring to agriculture. I have just maybe a few comments, and then I am headed to the airport. I think my drop dead time is 9:30, but 3 people this morning who are in charge of the program said, I understand you have to be out here by 9:15. So apparently my drop dead time to catch my flight is 9:15, Bob, and I'll keep it as I promised you. But I was, as Sarah indicated, I put 5,500 miles on my truck during this August recess. It was one of the few times in which I asked the leadership of the Senate to call us back into session with my anger and concern about what was transpiring in our departure in Afghanistan. I thought the United States Senate should be at work with officials under oath and testimony and hearings and the ability to convey on behalf of Kansans and my own views as to what should be taking place in Afghanistan. I would ask that you, in Republican majority days, I chair the Committee on Veterans Affairs in the Senate. I'm now the longest serving, I think, Republican in the history of serving on veterans committees both in the House and Senate. And I would just highlight and ask a favor of you for the good of the country and for the good of those who served our nation. The number of calls to the Veteran Suicide Hotline is up double digits. The texts and emails are the same. And the concern is that there are those who are seeing what's transpiring in Afghanistan and feeling that their service was not of value. And if you all could, the veterans that you know who served in Afghanistan and other places, if you'd reach out, make certain that they are aware of the value they sacrifice and that they did what they were asked to do and in fact kept the terrorism from attacking our country for the last 20 years from a base in Afghanistan as it happened 20 years ago last Saturday. Sarah will highlight and the other speakers, but I would bring my perspective. I mean, I'm returning to Washington, D.C. today. I think at front and center will continue to be this conversation of all the things that get wrapped up in trying to conclude the Democrats' attempt to conclude a $3.5 trillion spending package. what the Agriculture Committee has asked of its chairperson, what we all as Republicans have asked in our committees, is could we participate in that reconciliation process and have the Agriculture Committee, for example, have input into the provisions that are going to be reconciled to the budget. I think that will continue to be met with deaf ears, and so it is unlikely that in much of any way that Republicans, who often are the ones who represent agricultural and rural states, we will have little input in how the $3.5 trillion is spent. There is a lot of interest, and this was mentioned by Sarah earlier, that there is an increasing investment in agricultural research, potentially in the reconciliation bill, which many of us would consider valuable. In fact, Senator Durbin and I teamed up and we introduced the America Grows Act to increase USDA research by 5% every year for the next 10 years. We've worked a lot on NIH and other research entities. National Science Foundation has received a lot of attention. My view is that all of our research capacity in the United States, in order to be economically and in a national defense perspective, to be competitive with China and others, we need to up our game in research, and that includes agriculture. And again, we have a bipartisan effort by Senator Durbin and I to do that. As I traveled Kansas, probably the most significant conversation, I suppose two: one, the need for workers, and two, the concern about the tax changes that may come from paying for the $3.5 trillion bill, and most specifically stepped up basis and capital gains and estate taxes. Like-kind exchanges are often a part of that conversation as well, depending upon the nature of the business or agribusiness that I'm talking to. And fortunately, the Democrats in the House have chosen not to include that provision in their pay-fors. I also have seen or read where the Democrats are now beginning to wonder whether their $3.5 trillion bill needs to be paid for. And so maybe there will be less emphasis on those pay-fors, but the end result, if it's not paid for, is increasing inflation, which is another kind of tax on all of us. And so, in my view, spending needs to be paid for, and Republicans and Democrats were slow. Let me say it differently. Democrats and Republicans were slow in turning the spigot off on spending in regard to COVID. And the consequence is inflation, which the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board has tried to convince me is a temporary thing due only to supply chain problems. But you can't spend the trillions of dollars that we're spending and not expect there to be increasing costs resulting in inflation. And so that has a consequence. And Kansans are beginning, and it's returning to the days in which the budget, the deficit spending, inflation is now a significant topic of conversation from my constituents. We've working our way. I'm an ag appropriator, have chaired the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee. We've done our work, and it's passed the full committee, the full Appropriations Committee in the Senate. We're trying to tee up 12 appropriation bills. We've got 3 of them teed up to work our way. The goal is, of course, to have 12 appropriation bills march their way across the Senate floor, be passed by the House, and signed by the President by September the 30th. That will not happen. And we will have a continuing resolution that takes us sometime into December, would be my guess. And that continuing resolution is being drafted by my and other staff on the Appropriations Committee to accomplish no shutdown of government, but it's tied up with lots of other things, including reconciliation and debt ceiling increases. But I wanted to highlight in that appropriation bill, again, $7 billion to extend the WHIP program for 21 and 22. Disaster, while a little bit less in Kansas than it was in the past, is an issue across the country, and now with the hurricanes and floods, fires, we've had a lot of challenges in agriculture, and so Congress in our appropriation bill has responded in regard to disaster assistance. It might be a surprise to think about that the Farm Bill expires in 2023, which now no longer seems a long time away, but the Senate and House Agriculture Committee will be back at work beginning the process of what a new Farm Bill would look like. And I would highlight, again, markets. One of the things I'm having conversations with Kansans about is tariffs. I would mention one that stands out to me. We worked hard to keep the past administration from imposing tariffs on phosphates coming from Morocco because of the consequence to fertilizer prices. Those tariffs are in place. This administration seems to be intending to extend them, and we're seeing significant increases in the cost of fertilizer. And that is when farmers talk to me They want to make sure I've not forgotten about input costs and the differences today, and with reconciliation and all the challenges that the Democrats' energy policies are going to provide to the production of domestic energy and to our at least base fuels at the moment, fossil fuels, we will see increasing costs in the price of fuel, which means increasing costs in the price of fertilizer as well. This administration needs to hold China accountable for their phase 1 trade agreement and the agricultural imports that are expected to come from that. China is behind in its commitment to do so, but we earn a living in Kansas and in this country in agriculture based upon what we sell around the globe, and those markets remain the driving force for what price we receive for our commodities. I chair the Senate Hunger Caucus, and most of my colleagues are interested in food stamp programs, domestic kind of programs. I'm not uninterested in those things. In fact, many of them are necessities for keeping people from going to bed hungry in our country, but we continue to work, and I would highlight Afghanistan as a famine disaster in the making, and we're working to do a number of things in trying to get the UN food programs and our U.S. food programs to be able to respond. And we're always interested in those parts of, we're interested in all parts of the nutrition and prevention of starvation programs, hunger efforts. But we always want to make sure the part of the programs, Food for Peace, that actually takes U.S. grains and commodities. I've carried with me for 2 years and showed the President, the Secretary of Agriculture, the U.S. Trade Ambassador, grain piled high in Kensington, Kansas, as high as the grain elevator. There's no place to store it, and a reminder that we still have a hungry world, and we ought to be looking for ways in which we take the opportunity to feed people who could very much utilize the abundance of our production. I also would indicate that while I mentioned phosphate tariffs, steel tariffs are a topic. Our agricultural manufacturers in Kansas, access to raw materials, but the cost of raw materials are keeping production levels, as well as a lack of a growing workforce, are indicating to how difficult it's going to be for the cost to remain competitive as we try to manufacture in Kansas and provide that equipment for our actual farmers and ranchers. Last week I was at the Wheat Innovation Center in Manhattan, Kansas, and saw the latest in wheat research, and then toured the feed grain sciences program at Kansas State University and the Howell Ross flour mill. And good things happening with lots of students who are still interested in agriculture. And I again appreciate Dr. Featherson and K-State's efforts to find the workforce that this industry desperately needs. I'd conclude by just saying that the last time I was here 2 years ago, we were bragging about the capabilities that we saw in Kansas City to bring the federal workforce, in this case USDA employees, to Kansas City. And I appreciate this Secretary of Agriculture, who you're going to hear from shortly, his commitment to continue that program that was started by Secretary Perdue. And we continue the efforts to fulfill the jobs that were created in Kansas at NIFA and ERS. And what I think the answer is, because sometimes I read articles that talk about all the vacancies, but the vacancies are existent both in DC and in Kansas City. And we still need more people who are interested in the research and technical aspects of agriculture, and I always saw this as an opportunity for us to allow kids who grew up on a farm in the Midwest to find jobs in agriculture, even though they may not have a job on their family's farm or their neighbor's farm, and keep our kids in agriculture. And so I hope that Kansas City Business Council will continue to promote the opportunities for employment with USDA right here in our home city. I would segue from that point to highlight once again for you what I think is a major development in the agribusiness world that I hope that we do more to capitalize on than what we've done to date. It's not intended as a criticism. We're doing things, but in my view, the potential is significantly more, and that's NBAF, the National Agro-Bioscience Facility being built in Manhattan. And I was the author of the legislation that created the Animal Science Corridor from, in this audience, I'll actually mention the university in Missouri, because I usually say some university in Columbia. But in this audience, I'll say from Manhattan and K-State to Columbia and the University of Missouri. an animal science corridor, and we are the place in which the significant number of agribusinesses are located here, animal science in particular. But with the arrival of NBAF, and the construction date is March of 2022, which is not that far away, is construction completion. And in May of that year is the certification expectation for NBAF to go to work. And as I assume that everybody in this room would know, that's the goal of NBAF is to protect the U.S. livestock sector from foreign animal diseases, including zoonotic, and we'll have the BSL-4 laboratory as we replace Plum Island off the city of New York and put that effort here in the heartland. We've appropriated in the ag appropriation bill that I mentioned earlier, $63.4 million. I had the problem that you had, Sarah. We don't say those words. So $1 million, which funds NBAF at its necessary requested budget levels for full completion. And we have added money to the appropriation bill for training of a workforce to make sure that folks are ready and prepared to go to work at NBAF. And the estimated impact, 3.5, this one is $1 billion, $3.5 billion economic impact to this region in its first 20 years. About 1,000 construction jobs have been ongoing in Manhattan, and there's expected to be 350 to 400 highly technical scientific PhD positions in Manhattan. And I don't highlight this just for the sake of Manhattan. This is the opportunity for all of us to make certain that we do our part to bring the businesses, develop the scientific and agricultural laboratories necessary for NBAF's well-being. While NBAF is a huge economic opportunity, I want to say it differently. Why it and of itself is important, I think the real value economically is what can grow up around it. And this community, Kansas City, is poised for just to be in a perfect place with Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska all here, providing us with a lot of assets, and NBAF being kind of icing on the cake. And so any way that I can help Kansas City, any way I can help any community attract, in fact, I meet with a handful of businesses over the last year and a half who are interested in coming to this region just because of NBAF's arrival. Want to know what NBAF is going to mean and whether it's going to be completed, and we are there to reassure those businesses that we're on our way. So it is now 9:17. You got your way, Bob. I'm delighted to be with you. The first time I ever spoke to a civic club after I was elected to Congress was the Concordia, Kansas Rotary Club, and I was invited to come speak. I stood outside the restaurant, and the club president met me. He poked me in the chest and said, "Now, Congressman, you need to know our meeting concludes precisely at 1 o'clock, and if you speak much longer than that, our club has the habit of walking out." And I thought, well, what a warm welcome for your new congressman and a fellow Rotarian. Only then, there was a senator in Kansas who had a great knack for telling jokes and stories. It isn't me. But I remembered sitting there in Rotary Club that day about the little boy and his dad. Robert's probably told me this story. About the little boy and his dad who were in the church. It happened to be a Methodist church, and they were walking around. They got to the stained glass windows, and the boy asked his dad, "Now, Dad, what are the stars for? What are those stars for in the stained glass window?" The dad says, "Let me fill in one space." So I sat at the head table, only to discover that the club president was the local United Methodist minister. So the little boy asked his dad, "Dad, what are the stars for in those Methodist stained glass windows?" And the dad explained, "Son, that's for the people who died in the service." Little boy says, "That the 11 o'clock service or the 8:30 service?" And so I've been getting even with Reverend Ken Parker for a very long time. I've exceeded my Methodist minister's admonition by 4 minutes, but my primary purpose is to tell you that agriculture matters. It's a noble profession, feeding the world, clothing the world, providing energy to the world. And where we come from, here in the Midwest, I work to do everything I can to make sure agriculture is successful because it determines whether or not the communities that I represent have a future. And if agriculture is not successful, there is little hope for those communities that agriculture serves and lives in. Schools, restaurants, the cafe, the grain elevator, the farm implement dealership. All those things begin to disappear. But I also would tell you that in my view, we have a reason to keep rural America and agriculture alive and well, because it also develops a set of values, a matter of character, a thing called integrity, a work ethic, a belief in God and faith, those attributes that are hugely important to our country, something we desperately need today. And in the absence, I would ask you, I want to end on a positive note by making you feel good about where you come from and not so much worried about the country, but think how our country would be different today in the absence of something from Texas to North Dakota, this middle part of the country. And if it was only the East Coast and the West Coast, think what a different nation we would have been and what a different nation we will be in the future. Our ability to influence public policy and issues, to influence the culture of this country still exists. It gets diminished sometimes as population and demographics change, but we matter for purposes of taking care of ourselves and our own families, but we matter for taking care of the future of this nation, and agriculture and rural America has to remain strong if we're going to have a country that we recognize as the United States of America. Thank you for allowing me to join you.